doing a mitzvah of Torah study, which is in of itself a mitzvah. In fact, there's a great classic where the fellow comes to the rabbi and he begs the rabbi to teach him Talmud. Now the rabbi sees this is just not the right individual for studying Talmud. So he says, before you study the Talmud, you need to have an exam. And this is how it's going to work. I'm going to ask you some questions and we'll test your analytical skills. So the rabbi asks the visitor, tell me, if two people climb in through the chimney and, to break into the house, they climb into the chimney, come out to the fireplace. One of them got all dirty from the soot and the ashes, and the other didn't. Which one of them would take a shower? So the guy says, well, of course, the fellow who got dirty. So the rabbi says, no, you're not thinking straight. The fellow who was all black looks at the other guy, he sees he came out clean. So he figures he also came out clean. So he doesn't bother taking a shower. While the other guy looks at his friend and sees he got all black with the suit, he says, I must have gotten all dirty too, and he takes the shower. The fellow says, yeah, I didn't think of that. The rabbi says, you're still confused. You don't understand. When the first guy sees the second guy taking the shower, he realizes, I must take a shower too, because if he's taking one, that means I got dirty too, and I should be taking a shower too. And the visitor is starting to get dizzy, but he says, Rabbi, you got me on that one. And the rabbi says, no, you missed the point completely. How is it even possible for two people to come into a house, to climb through the chimney, and not get dirty? Of course, they'll both come out black. The whole question doesn't make sense to begin with. And this visitor is getting exasperated. He says, Rabbi, I give up. And the rabbi says, I'm not done with you yet. You missed the most important thing. You think when the burglars climb through the chimney, they're worried about a shower? They're grabbing the jewelry and they're going to run. So I guess you're not ready to study the Talmud. You're just getting all confused. You can't follow through the thought process. But this is just, all jokes aside, a way to illustrate a little bit how much back and forth you might get in the Talmud. Something that many people found fascinating, really all over the world and throughout history. And we'll talk about that, but really we're going to talk about Torah study overall as a whole, Talmud and otherwise. Now, the interesting part of all of this is that our discussion of Torah study is part of our series of do-it-yourself mitzvahs, because Torah study is in of itself a mitzvah. We typically don't think of it that way. We tend to think of the study of Torah as information, as what we need to know in order to do the mitzvah, but actually the study of Torah is in of itself a mitzvah that we are instructed to do. We say it every day in the Shema. One of the many quick mitzvahs we refer to in the Shema is V'dibarta bam, which means speak of them. Speak of these words, the words of the Torah, be engaged in these words of the Torah, study them, speak of them, examine them, and invest in them. That is the mitzvah that we have of Torah study. So what's this mitzvah all about? Why is it important? And how do we do this mitzvah right? So the first thing, the first purpose, the first objective, hi Alex. The first reason why we would study Torah is to know what to do. We can't know how to fulfill the mitzvahs without studying the Torah and learning the laws. So in order to know how to do the mitzvahs, how to live the life that God has designed for us, we need to be studying the Torah. In fact, someone once asked a great rabbi, why do you have this yeshiva with so many students studying so much Torah? How many rabbis do we need anyway? So the rabbi says, you don't understand. My yeshiva is not here to train rabbis. My yeshiva is to train all kinds of people who will know when it is even necessary to ask a question of the rabbi. In other words, without studying the Torah and getting the information, we wouldn't even know what the mitzvahs are and have any idea how to fulfill them, never mind where it gets complicated and we might need help from an expert. just to know what to do, to know the parameters and how to do them, we need to study the Torah. So that's the first and most basic purpose for Torah study, is to know how to fulfill the mitzvahs. But really, it's not only about fulfilling the mitzvahs, but it's about how we live life. Because the Torah is really the user's manual that God gave us together with his product. The product God created is the world we live in, and he gave us a user's manual that we're meant to read and live by in this world. And of course, as usual, just like when you buy your iPhone, you don't bother to read the user's manual. Many people don't read the user's manual and they don't know what to do. But the Torah is there to guide us, not only in the actual fulfillment of mitzvahs, but in how to live a good and appropriate life overall. In fact, Torah provides direction, provides guidance and insight for every field and for every area of life. Sometimes we would least expect it. It seems most unlikely that the Torah would have insight for us. There's something to be learned from the Torah there too. That's why the Torah is described as the blueprint of the world. What that would mean is, just like if there's a contractor building a home, there's a blueprint that which he follows. So God actually designed the world according to the Torah. In other words, the Torah existed prior to God's creation of the world. And once the Torah was there, God created a world to conform with it. So the universe really plays out ideas that are in the Torah. And that's why we can always find insight in the Torah for whatever might be going on in our world. In fact, there's a unique story of the Rebbe bringing out this point, which I wanted to share using this video clip. Here we go.
Rivka Blau is the daughter of Rabbi Mordechai Pinchas Teitz, a prominent rabbinic activist and chief rabbi of Elizabeth, New Jersey. In 1961, she was vice president of Yavne, one of the first Orthodox student organizations on American college campuses.
Our mission statement was that we wanted to promote Jewish learning and Jewish observance on campus, and that we wanted to, I don't remember the exact wording, but that we wanted to enable people who want to know more about their Jewishness to find out, but we knew we had to know more if we were going to be that kind of a presence on campus. It was essentially Jewish learning, Jewish observance, and not to feel so alone. And that if people wanted to learn more, we would be available to help them. Those were pretty much that was the essence of the mission statement. And at that time, we already had, I think, between 13 and 15 college groups involved. And we also had isolated students in different places. At Rutgers, we had 3 or 4 students. At the University of Pennsylvania, we had some students. Now, at that time, the Lubavitch Rebbe had a representative who would come to Columbia and who got friendly with the president of Yavne, Joel Levine. And this young man, his last name was Feller, told Joel and me, well, actually he told Joel first and then Joel told me, that he wanted to meet with 2 officers of Yavne and to talk to us about how we had gotten started and what we were doing. Our appointment was for 10 o'clock at night, so we came to 770 Eastern Parkway at 10 o'clock at night, and we were asked to come in to see the Rebbe at 12 o'clock, because there were many, many people there waiting to see him. And when we came in, he greeted us in a friendly, very friendly way, and I brought him regards from my father, and he sent regards back, and it was really very, very friendly. And then the Rebbe gave us our choice of what language we should conduct the meeting in. And when he started saying languages, he was smiling because he knew that it was funny. And out of the different languages he offered us, I think when he reached either Russian or French, I forget where it was, but we decided English would be the language that we would choose. And he smiled and he said, "Fine, we'll do this in English." And he asked us many detailed questions about how we had started, how we had found each other, what we were finding on campus, what were the problems, what were the possibilities, what opportunity was there for people who were interested in finding more about their Jewishness, how could we reach them, what do we find worked well, what do we find what we found did not work. Very, very to the point questions. At the end, he said, well, I've asked you a lot of questions. Would you like to ask me some questions? And I had no questions to ask of the Rebbe. I thought that this was a wonderful meeting that we had just now had, and I said, no, thank you. And the fellow who was with me said, well, yes, I've spent a Shabbos or two here in Crown Heights, courtesy of this young man that I know from Lubavitch, and I hear all kinds of wonder stories about you. I hear that you know better than the doctor whether there should be surgery or not. You know better than the lawyer which way to proceed with a case. Do you know more medicine than the doctors? Do you know more law than the lawyers? I mean, what kind of thing is this? So the Rebbe smiled, and he said, you know, when a house gets built, the architect draws up a blueprint. He gives the blueprint to the contractor, and then the contractor tells the plumber how to do the plumbing, the mason how to do the masonry, the electrician how to do the electricity, the electrical work. He said it's not that the contractor can do it better than everybody, but he can read the blueprint, and that's why he can give the instructions. So he said, Hashem is takel ba'raiso vara alma. The blueprint of the world is the Torah. So somebody can understand Torah, he can tell other people what they have to do within their own métier. So I thought that was a beautiful answer, and I was ready to go. But unfortunately, this young man had another question. And at this question, I blushed. I was really very embarrassed. And the Rebbe just smiled because, again, this was not a difficult question for him. But the young man was persistent, and he said, yes, but I hear all kinds of wonder stories about you, and really almost miraculous stories about you. Can all these stories be true? So the Rebbe laughed, and he said, you know, if they're telling stories about me, they figure I know these stories. So I have no idea what stories are being told. I can't vouch for a single one of them. I can't verify them for you. However, and then he gave us a list of misnagdim, who are great people. He said, if you ask me those stories about A and B and C, well, those I have read in Svarim. I've read them in books that I trust. And those stories about the wondrous things that they did, those stories you can trust. So trust those stories, and I would have to check out the stories that are being told about me. It was such a wonderful answer. And he said it with a smile.
All right, so just a little insight of what comes from true expertise in the Torah, really the law and of the Torah's scripture and teachings that are not directly practical instruction. Why do we study those parts of the Torah? What is the other objective in studying Torah that is fulfilled even when there is no practical implementation? Well, actually, the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, pointed this out in his book, in the Tanya, where he discusses the immense power of an intellectual relationship. So God is God and man is man. And it's not always easy or even possible for a limited human being to create a relationship and an association with God. It just doesn't seem accessible. But the Torah that we were given and this information that we have is actually divine wisdom. These are God's ideas. These are God's teachings. This is God's thesis, if you will. This is his insight. And when we study that, we incorporate that insight into our own minds. Now, what happens is when you use your mind to analyze an idea, no matter what that idea might be, the content and your intellectual capacity, your brain, are inseparable. You're not able to say that I took an idea and I inserted it into a box, which is my brain. It obviously doesn't work that way. It's much less tangible than that. The intellectual concept is flowing within the cells of your brain, and within your intellectual capabilities, they actually fuse into one. There's no point where you can say, this is the idea, the abstract, and this is the brain that is thinking the idea. They really merge and become one unit. When our minds and our capabilities of understanding are dedicated to understanding God's ideas and God's Torah, that fuses us and binds us and connects us to God in a way that nothing else can, in a way that we become intertwined in this inseparable relationship with the godly idea that we're contemplating. So it's an opportunity that exists within our world, hierarchy. It's an opportunity for us to connect to God, which is actually not found anywhere else. So this actually will help us understand something that may sound a bit strange. Let's have a look. This is what the prophet instructs Joshua, the successor to Moshe, early on, right after Moshe's passing, and Joshua is beginning to lead the Jewish people into Israel. The prophet says, "This book of the Torah shall not leave your mouth. You shall study therein day and night, in order that you observe to do all that is written to it. For then you will succeed in all your ways, and then will you prosper." So the book of Torah shall not leave your mouth. You should study Torah day and night, around the clock. Constantly study the Torah. Why? Why so intensely? Why so constantly? Day and night, never take a break. What's that about? What's that about? Well, that's because of what we mentioned. That's because the Torah is your golden opportunity, not only to know what to do and how to do it, but to truly open a unique, powerful, and inseparable relationship with God, with our Creator, and therefore it is really the most precious thing that we have. Now, it's important to note that there is a very different way to read this. We read, "You shall study therein day and night." We took that to mean constantly, all day and all night. But actually, there's another way that this is read in the Talmud, which establishes a minimum requirement, and that is to study the Torah a bit every morning and a bit every night. So you spend a few minutes in the daytime and a few minutes at nighttime studying Torah before you go do whatever it is that you have to do. So you might be not studying 24 hours a day, all day and all night, but you spend even just 5 minutes during the day and 5 minutes during the night. You're studying at the daytime, you're studying at the nighttime. It's constantly a part of your life. So it turns out that we have two different ways to read this, which would also be two different conclusions. Do you study the Torah all day and all night, or just a little bit at the daytime and a little bit at nighttime? And the answer, according to Hasidic teachings, is that both of these things are true. The ideal in one concept would have been to study the Torah all day and all night, but it is also possible for others to get by with just studying a little bit every day and a little bit every night. Now, how do we know who we are? How do we know what's the right way for us? Or in other words, if it's about the soul, and the soul of one individual should be studying Torah constantly while the other should have a full-time job and just study just really a little bit in the morning and evening, how would I know which one I am? Well, the answer is that we don't really know, but God does. And he sets up the circumstances of life the way they should be. So most of us who don't find it possible to be constantly studying Torah, and we need to do our jobs and live up to our responsibilities and do whatever it is we have going on, that's because God set it up that way for us, because he knew our soul and he knew our Torah study, and he knew that we can manage and what we need to achieve can be done in a couple minutes every day and a couple minutes every night. Somebody else had a different soul and a different destiny, and God wanted him or her to study constantly and therefore made it possible in that person's life. So if you're not finding it possible to literally study day and night with no interruption, that's probably because you weren't meant to, and that's okay. Just remember to always have a little bit of it in your life every morning and every evening. So what's in the Torah? What does it mean to study Torah? What books do we read? What study do we do when we're doing this great mitzvah and great possibility and opportunity of studying the Torah? So of course there's the written Torah, the scrolls we know from the synagogue, which is the 5 books of Moses, and then the other books of the prophets and the writings of the complete Bible. That's the base of the Torah. That's what we study. We also study the oral Torah, which is of course no longer oral, but transcribed in the Talmud and other books. And then there are endless more books from there, constant, endless stream, a library of thousands of books from people of the book, from the Jewish people throughout the generations, books of Torah on every subject from every angle, in every field, and in every way. All of this is Torah, and all of this counts as studying Torah, and all of that is precious and special. But there are some priorities. There are some priorities we should keep in mind when we think about what Torah we will study and how we will study it. The first priority would be the practical. Make sure you know what to do and how to do it. Study the Torah like we're doing in this series of the mitzvahs that there are to do and how to do them. That would be the most important Torah study. Make sure you know the mitzvahs and you get them done right. There's also the basic. Make sure you know the basic ideas of the Torah, the basic Jewish history discussed in the Torah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the basic teachings of our faith, the basic understanding of what it means to be a Jew and what the Torah is giving us in our world. Another element of Torah to prioritize is the Hasidic component, or the Kabbalistic and mystical ideas, what we call the teachings of Hasidus. And what this means is that really the Torah would figuratively have a body and a soul. So when I walk down the street and I meet you or anybody else, I don't meet a lot of people these days, but theoretically speaking, you walk down the street and you bump into someone, you see their body, you see their physical presence, you hear their voice, you talk to the physical human being, but you know that there's a soul inside, there's an emotional component, there's a personality, and there's actually a spiritual soul within that human being that you met. You may not have yet met the soul and gotten to know it well, but every person has that soul. So when we study the Torah, we see laws, we see stories, we see basic, tangible, physical information, but we have to understand there's also a soul inside. Every one of those ideas, every one of those teachings, every one of those messages or guidelines or rules have a spiritual element, have a soul, have a deeper component to them. And that is the study of Kabbalah, the study of Jewish mysticism, the study of Hasidism. It's the same ideas that we're studying on Torah at a basic level, but seeing them from the soul's perspective, seeing the spiritual side of them. Not only studying how are we going to do the mitzvah of wearing tefillin or eating kosher or any other things we did, but what does that mean and how do we live and experience that in a soul dimension, in a spiritual sense? What does that mean in the godly world? What does that mean in the level of the soul? And therefore, it's an important study that lets us feel a tangible closeness to God. Because we made the case that studying the Torah creates a relationship and a bond with God, the author of the Torah. And that's true, but we don't always recognize it. We might be studying the laws of kosher, to use the same example, and we'll be reading about milk and about meat, and we won't be feeling God's presence very much. We'll just be dealing with the nitty-gritty. Sometimes you can get caught up with that. Sometimes you lose the forest for its trees. When we study the teachings of Hasidism, that brings us back to the soul component, to the spiritual component, to remember that deeper side of the Torah and retain that active, tangible connection to God, to the Torah's author. So, what's the history here? Torah was given to us at Mount Sinai 3,332 years ago, right after the Jews left Egypt. At that point, the Kabbalah was less known. Moshe taught these mystical ideas only to a select few, and the focus was really on the laws of the Torah. Also, as we've discussed in the past, there was only a limited amount of written material, and the rest was oral. Over time, this was studied, expanded on, developed into the many books that we had. The oral Torah was committed to writing almost 2,000 years ago. The rulings of the halakha, of the codes of Jewish law, were formulated from there, which previously were not available in an organized fashion. We've talked about that too. And really the teachings of Hasidism and Jewish mysticism only became well known and widespread in much later on. So originally with the publication of the Zohar, which was authored by Rabbi Shimon in the time of the Talmud, but only became well known much later on. And only in the last, say, 300-400 years has there really been a lot of study of these ideas. Why now? Why is the study of Hasidism and these deeper components of the Torah more emphasized now? Well, there are a lot of reasons for this. And one of them has to do again with the coming of the Mashiach. Because when the Mashiach does come, and should that be very soon, and we experience that better world, our study will be focused on the spiritual side of Torah. Most of life will sail the way it should. We'll know what to do and how to do it. We'll know the law. We'll have that worked out. We won't be constantly challenged by it. We'll be focused on knowing God, on studying and understanding the spiritual dimension of our world and our relationship with God. We'll be studying Hasidism to its extreme. And as we study it now, we're really preparing, getting into the mode of what we will be doing then. So in these last centuries of the end of the time of the suffering of the Jewish people, shall we say, the end of the exile, the end of the period when we are so challenged and leading towards the better time that we're hoping for with the coming of Mashiach, we already start to study these teachings, the soul of the Torah, the teachings of Hasidism, as a prelude to what will come then. So in all of these classes, do-it-yourself mitzvah, we always make sure to talk about the practical. What's the practical? How do we practically implement the mitzvah of studying Torah? So first thing to remember, we talked about is studying the Torah every day, even if it's just for a little bit. Try to incorporate a little bit of study of Torah into each day of your life. One way to do that is we talked about a couple weeks ago, the study of the Rambam cycle, the cycle of Maimonides, where we study those teachings throughout the year. And there is an app and a couple other resources. We talked about how you can actually have that come up every day and read the daily reading. The same can be done for the Chitas, which would be daily portions of the Torah itself and daily portions of other critical works. So there are many opportunities to incorporate at least a few minutes of study in each and every day. Another thing to remember is that we should study on our level. Today, thank God, there are so many books presenting the Torah in every language, for every background, for every style, for every topic. You can get a hold of a book, and I can help with that talks to you on your level, addresses a topic that you're interested in, and speaks in a language that you understand, and study Torah in a way that it feels relevant and close to you, and you can actually appreciate it and grow with it each and every day. Another component in Torah study is what we're doing now, participating in a class, getting together with other people, whether in person or virtually, getting together with other Jews and making that study of Torah a communal experience, which increases the energy and the spiritual connection that there is in that Torah experience. And finally, never forget to include the teachings of Hasidism, those mystical soul components in the Torah that we've been talking about. There are another two, shall we say, practical elements that are maybe not the core mitzvah of studying Torah itself, but they are important here and they are things the Rebbe campaigned about. The first is education. We should not only study Torah, we should share Torah, we should teach Torah. Going back to the Shema, we quoted earlier, the Shema reads, Vishinantam levanecha, teach them to your children. We should not only be studying Torah, but imparting the Torah, teaching it to our children, and really teaching it to others, to what the Talmud calls figurative children, because students are also described as children, someone that we raise and lift up in this world. So we should not only study, but share the study of Torah with others, whether that's inviting them to join for a Torah class or actually teaching them directly. And none of us should feel that that's something that we can't do. The Rebbe famously said that if somebody knows Aleph, they should teach Aleph. Someone knows Bet, they should teach Bet. Now, what that means, of course, is that the Hebrew alphabet begins with the letters Aleph and Bet. And I might think, I only know the Aleph, I just started. I'm not ready to teach others. But the Rebbe would say, if you know Aleph, share that Aleph. And so when you learn the Bays, you'll share that Bays. So any bit of Torah knowledge that you have can and should be shared with others. Another thing the Rebbe talked about in the context of Torah study is having Torah books at home. We called Bayis Molis Sfarim, a home full of Jewish books. We should have make it a point to acquire books of the Torah, books of Jewish teachings, books of Jewish ideas, and keep them at home so that we both have more opportunities and more reminders to actually read and study the Torah in these many books, as well as we get into that spirit, we bring the spirit of Torah study and the spirit and the atmosphere and the environment of what these books represent into our home and into our lives. So let's all study, let's all increase our knowledge and our study of the Torah, and hopefully we all grow in that way. Thursday, we will continue. Thursday, we have a class that actually talks a little bit on this angle of using the Torah as a blueprint for life. We're going to go into what might be a fraught topic, and that is some of the rules of war, because there's, of course, we always hope to avoid war. But when there is war or violence or trouble of that nature, how should one conduct themselves? What would be the ethical way? Is it okay for a society to launch a preemptive strike, attack the enemy first before anything happened, like the Israelis did in the 6-Day War? What about collateral damage? You attack the enemy and some bystanders are hurt or killed. How should we view that? So such ideas, how the Torah would teach us the proper way to approach the unfortunate reality of war and doing it in the most ethical way possible, we will talk about that on Thursday. Wednesday, of course, we have the women's class as usual. And for now, I'm going to wish everyone a good night and stop the live stream.